Yeah, I'm Will LaVeist. He's Derek Claville. You tune into LaVeist and Claville, where we give it to you straight the way it is, from a black male's perspective, because it's like that, and that's the way it is. So let's get right to this show. The Chauvin, Derek Chauvin verdict. Still reeling from this, this issue of the murder of George Floyd. So the verdict is finally in. Derek Chauvin was sentenced to 22.5 years for the murder of George Floyd. Chauvin was not remorseful, and there are still many people who feel justice wasn't fully served by the amount of time that he got. And there's also still many who feel that, quite frankly, he still shouldn't have gotten any time at all. So, the amount of time wasn't enough. Is it justice? Where are we at now, and where are we going? I mean, Claville, you're the attorney. Talk to us. I mean, was this enough time? 22.5 years. Is this the right number? What's going on here? Explain it.
Well, Will, to be honest with you, no matter how much time you got, you were going to have one side that was satisfied and the other side that's not. We have to also take into consideration that this was a person that used his position of power, of trust, inflicted one of the worst types of pain on another human being.
Absolutely. Death.
And took his life away. It was one of the most humiliating ways to die. You had another grown man begging for his life from another man who was there to protect and serve. He did it so cavalier.
As people watched.
And filmed.
Yes.
Think about it. He literally had no sense of fear.
And thank God it was filmed.
It happened. Adverse. Because he's being filmed. And every time I watch it, and to be very honest with you, it was one time I had to turn it off. I couldn't watch it again. It was just too much. Which I believe that the young lady that received the honorary Pulitzer Prize for her bravery to record that. Because without her recording, without the restraint,
absolutely,
and the humanity of the citizens that were there begging for the officer to please let him up over and over again, this moment would not have come.
Yeah, because you had other officers who were there who were watching on, and those trials are coming as well. But that just reinforces the whole issue of, in the Black community, police, the concept of protect and serve seems to be elusive when it comes to Black and brown people, because you had other officers who were there watching this on the scene. He's, like you said, he's being filmed doing this. And then to add insult to injury, I can tell you from a reporter standpoint, the initial police report that went in, you would have thought that nothing as tragic, as violent, as inhumane had actually gone on. So yes, the filming of this is critical, and now we finally have the verdict, at least with Chauvin, with the others to come.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you mentioned the initial police report. Right. The initial police report, like you said, if you take a look at it, audience, just go, look it up. It is one that shows that, like you said, it was nothing just happened. It was, a routine stop. Somebody died, and it was a resistance, and that was it. Even it took a force, a movement of requests in order to get the police department to turn over additional information. So it's not like the police department was like, oh, we got a bad officer, a bad apple, let's cooperate immediately. They didn't do that. They only did it when they were their feet were held to the fire and they had to be accountable. And one thing about this, and we're going to talk about a verdict in just a moment, but in thinking about the trial, you think about this, Will, you have every major officer within the head of those divisions, top to the training, to the supervisory, speak out against what Chauvin did because it wasn't in line with what they do. But of course, with that policy. However, it happens all the time because there are other cases that they're looking at in which he did this same thing to other citizens. So this is something that is systemic. The department is under now federal review. So let's see if they get it right.
Yeah, and give the officers credit, the police chief, others who, as well as other officers across the nation and across the world, frankly, who said, this is over the line. And I think that's a point that's often missed among those who want to say that this is going overboard in terms of calls for defunding the police or police reform. They're missing the fact that there are a lot of officers who are also talking about police reform and who have said in this particular case, this is over the line. And so, we give credit where it's due. We should give credit to those officers as well. But Absolutely. This verdict, again, a lot of people are concerned about whether this is really the right number. I know that he got some time served as well. I mean, explain what the numbers are.
So, let me break down the verdict for you. So he could have gotten up to 40 years for all the charges which he were convicted of. They ended up convicting him. The prosecution wanted 30 years.
Right.
The defense wanted probation and time served.
Of course.
Because you said there were many that felt like he shouldn't have gotten time, and that was one of them. But also, and believe it or not, there are people that believe still a very, very large percentage of individuals that believe that George Floyd was killed through a normal police stop. In other words, the officer himself should not be blamed for it. So that's a very, very high percentage. And we've talked about that in our Justice for George Floyd series. You can go back and take a look at it and see how we discuss this. But he wanted probation, time served. Prosecution wanted 30 years. Could have gotten up to 40. The judge himself awarded, or I'll say awarded, but handed down 22 and a half years with 199 days for time served while he was in custody awaiting trial. So let me say this, getting time served is not unusual. Okay. So that's something that happens quite often. So that's not the issue. The 22 and a half years, if you take a look at it, he actually provided that sentence based upon the highest crime in which he was convicted. Now, of course, he was convicted of lesser and what's called lesser and included offenses, but he was sentenced at the highest crime of that he was convicted of. So with that being the case, I think that it was quite a bit of time based upon how the judge actually handed down the sentence. Could he have gotten more? The answer is yes. But I think what we should take a look at is they got to go into the details. A judge can provide a sentence without possibility of parole. You can get that. It's handed out all the time. Right. When there's no possibility of parole, your only way of getting out of prison before your time served is through an appeal, which Derek Chauvin, he's going to appeal.
Right.
So that's going to happen. I doubt if the appellate court overturns anything. Everything was done by the book, very carefully, very methodical. Hats off to the Attorney General Ellis, who, of course, was a former U.S. Congressman. Hats off to the prosecution office. This was a well-planned, orchestrated case by the prosecution. It was almost flawless. Right. That's how you prosecute. Now, the other part of that is the judge did not say without possibility of parole. So what does that mean? That means that Derek Chauvin is, under Minnesota law, under these sentencing guidelines, he is eligible for parole after serving 15 years. He's got to serve 2/3 of the time in order to apply for parole. Now,
so he's definitely looking at least 15 years. And
hands down.
Chances are, again, being a police officer, this type of crime, the sentiment that's on both sides in the country, there's a good likelihood that after the 15 years, when he immediately becomes his earliest eligibility, he's probably going to get parole. What do you think?
You and I, we've talked about this, offline, and I don't know. I mean, if you take a look at the circumstance, and we actually talked a little bit about it during the segment, that was a heinous crime.
Yeah.
I mean, it was. Can you go back and take a look at that 15 years from now and say this person deserves parole? And especially after, and I want you to talk about this from your perspective as a journalist who's covered a lot of different stories. Can you see he deserves parole after his quote unquote condolences to the family of what he said to the courtroom?
Well, I tell you, that's another big issue. I mean, he was not remorseful.
Zero.
Like you said, he offered, condolences, and then to add to that, even his mother, who you can understand, caring, loving mother, is not going to want to see their adult child go to prison. But even the mother said something to the effect that if you sentencing my son, you're sentencing me too. And I'm thinking, when I read that, I'm like, okay, that's going to go over real well with the Floyd family, because they have been sentenced too. In fact, they've been sentenced to death. She can at least go and visit her son. They can't go and visit their loved one. So that type of lack of remorse, yeah, I think it's possible that it can have an impact. But we also live in an age where time goes by really fast. People's memories change very quickly. And so you're talking about 15 years from now, who knows what the country is going to be like with our era that we're in right now, with fake news and even things that we know are factual, people are putting into question and creating doubt. Who knows what it will be like in 15 years. So, I always go back to the Rodney King trial and saw how brutally beat down he was.
Yeah.
And then it went to a jury and they were all exonerated. And it said, so, no one thought that would be the case. But yes, the country has moved forward in many ways. The fact that this verdict was even able to happen is a statement in and of itself of how the country has moved forward. But we also have a way of taking 2 steps forward and taking 3 or 4 steps back too. So we don't know. I'm not sure how it's going to look like in 15 years, but I'm not terribly optimistic about where we'll be at that point and how well people will really, how they'll feel about it. Hopefully, he will express some real, true, honest remorse and come to grips with the level of violence and inhumanity that he displayed on that in that moment.
Yeah, well, you mentioned a very good point. 15 years from now, what does the world look like? 2036. Mm-hmm. Okay, 2036.
Okay.
That is a few years away from a possibility where I can retire. But who knows? Because there is some.
Better that, boy. I'm with you with that, boy. Doesn't mean we won't be doing anything. It just means that we won't have to go out every day.
Exactly.
We'll definitely stay active. But go ahead.
Absolutely. So, but again, I said, who knows after some of this legislation that's going to reframe and revamp retirement time. But 15 years from now, there's going to be a lot of changes in the world. But one thing I can say, you mentioned Rodney King case. I thought about other famous trials. The world is a different place. Rodney King could not happen today with an acquittal. It wouldn't happen.
Really? Yeah.
Will, it couldn't happen. That was too much evidence, right? But that was something that was accepted in LA police at that time. As a matter of fact, it was accepted decades before that. When you talk about the Ramparts Scandal, which also happened around the time of Rodney King.
What you remember, but think about it. This trial with Derek Chauvin, one of the key issues was whether the trial should have been moved to a different community. That is what happened with Rodney King. It was moved from LA Simi Valley, which was definitely a community that was more favorable to police. So
absolutely,
when you add those kinds of elements and we see the resurgence of a blatant open racism, because, I say resurgence not to be naive that racism has gone away or gone asleep. It hasn't. But when you see this openness about it and how it's being carried on in a younger generation, it leaves room for doubt to say, well, if a trial like this, and this trial, the Derek Chauvin trial, had been moved to a different community that was more favorable in terms of racial makeup, who's to know what the verdict would have been, whether it would have been as emphatic as this one.
Absolutely. And I always think, Will, when you made that, when you gave that point about the trial being moved, again, I give hats off to the AG's office in Minnesota, to the prosecution. I mean, they really held to their guns because, of course, that was one of the motions to move the trial as well to a police-friendly or defense-friendly venue.
Right.
So, there are a lot of things that come into play before trial actually takes place, which is why I tell people, in trial, everything, you win your case, you win or lose your case in what's called pretrial.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever happens pretrial, that's the only thing that can come into trial. And trial itself is just a well-rehearsed dance. So what the prosecution did, again, we cannot overlook and overstate the job that they did to present the case in a way that really it presented itself. But we know how these narratives can change because,
right. Yeah.
Again, I mentioned those polls, Will, where you have a certain segment of the population that believe that Derek Chauvin did nothing wrong. And that population is overwhelmingly white American, overwhelmingly Republican as well, and overwhelmingly an older white American. So when you take a look at the standards that were set years ago, they're still holding on to that standard. But but I do have a lot of optimism for the future, and I'll give you the reason why.
Okay.
One of the descendants of the Supreme Court Justice Taney, that actually decided was one of the justices that decided the Dred Scott case, which was the legal pin that set off the Civil War, or legal shot. He actually wrote the decision that said there are no rights that any black man has that any white man is bound to respect. Right? I mean, so he didn't have to write that because the case was actually overturned on a procedural process, not a substantive. So he didn't have to write anything, but he wrote that for a reason. All right, in order to make a statement that the white man is above any rights that any black man has.
There's definitely a caste system. There's definitely a pecking order. And
absolutely.
The black man is at the bottom. Right.
Absolutely. So one of his descendants actually attended a session where he and the descendants of the Plessy case actually came together and talked about a lot of different things about racial reconciliation and things of that nature. And Will, one thing that he said, I have, and he's a retired advertisement executive and been around the country and the world. Okay. And he has access to a lot of places, right? That the average American doesn't have. And he made the statement. He said, what is your viewpoint of the future? Because of him being the descendant of the justice that wrote that. He made this statement. He said, I don't have a lot of hope for people of my generation. He said, but for my grandchildren, not his children, but he said, for my grandchildren, I have a lot of hope and optimism that things will become more equal, because, of course, that was one of the issues of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. So, in listening to that, you have to think about that. Someone that says that, it comes from a lineage of holding those beliefs, and a person who is able to keep those beliefs in law, which means those behaviors continue on and are perpetuated. And it took a civil war to stop it, right? Those words, it took a war of thousands and thousands and thousands of people to die to get it. So
Well, I see your point. I mean, because he is representative of it. I mean, because clearly his ancestor would not have made that statement. And so for us to come generations forward and he's making that statement, I'd love to share in that optimism. I do hope as well that with our grandchildren and going forward that there will be more equality, justice, more respect across the board, that this insanity of racism, that just because of your skin color determines your value and your place in society, is really just is illogical. It's madness. Is not rooted in any real science, or it's not godly. But people do strongly hold to it. It is really is troubling as we see the amount of racism that's rising up among and being carried forward among younger generations. So when you talk about the future, one of the things that we have that's pending now is the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2021, Civil Rights Act, looking at reforming police, but it's very much stuck. It's very much being debated. It's very much not really moving forward. I mean, so that's another reason there to be less than optimistic about the future. What can you say about that act and where we're at, and what's the likelihood of it getting passed?
So Will, that's a very good point, because right now the George Floyd Crime and Policing Act itself is one that is pretty much stalled. It's one that had a lot of hope. I mean, people marched forward across the country. I mean, people sacrificed. You had people traveling to and fro. I had young people going to this place. They were galvanizing around this issue of policing and really accountability, both community and policing. And all of a sudden it's stalled.
This is why young people went to the streets. Young people of all different backgrounds, races, went to the streets to say this is enough. And now here we are. It's stalling.
Absolutely. And look, unfortunately, Will, I mean, this is something where there is a lack of trust brewing from the young progressive, what they're called progressive, they're called young liberals, however you want to address it. But the young people that are going to the polls, voting for individuals that say, hey, we can do this, we can do that, we can do this, we can do that. Hands down, they're saying, you know what? I don't know. If the political process is for me. I don't know if we can make change through the political process. You're saying vote for change, but we're not getting the change.
Right.
I think what's missing is that, where we grew up, we understood political style speeches to be just that. They start and stop at the stump. Okay, that's what they are. But the real meat to policy is behind the scenes. The real meat to policy is dealing and working with legislators. And again, we talked about protesting and policy, lobbying and protesting. Where does it all meet? That's that circle that if the protesters, if the community, if the grassroots organizations can grasp that lobbying part from protests, put lobby in the middle, and then policy, and then just keep that circle going. I mean,
but what is the leverage that moves when you're putting that policy and lobbying piece in it? What is the leverage that moves these politicians to do the right thing? Because taking to the streets has its place, right? But what often happens and what we've seen is that as different elements raise and hit the streets and increase the level of violence, right? Whereas essentially undermining the peaceful protesters, right? As the violence increases, what happens is now both sides, right, start saying, well, we've got to have law and order. We've got to have law and order. And so what is the leverage to lobbying and putting that piece together that moves these politicians?
Absolutely. Well, the piece is, Will, hey, if you want our vote, then this is what has to happen. And you have to have a mechanism in place that holds them to it, period. That's it. And then
that's what a lot of people are asking. Okay, well, what is that mechanism? Because a lot of people who are voted in place right now, so Biden, our president, very much voted in place because folks are saying, we want you to make this change. Now he is very much, as you just said, we're very much in a stalemate when it comes to, George Floyd, justice, and police and that.
Yeah, and Will, what it is that you have to have someone that is connected in that process, that basically says, listen, we're not going to be bought, which is a hard thing to do. That's a hard thing to do because, lobbying is where you can be bought. And that's where the buying takes place all around. So you have to have someone who is connected to the community and says, I'm doing this for the community's sake. Now, that's the power. Now, I'm making that statement, and here's an example. That's the power of persons in what's called the classical civil rights movement. They weren't getting paid money to march the streets and register people to vote and put their lives on the line. They were helping each other out. You can stay at my house. We're going to, cook here. We're going to do this. We're going to get up and train here. People were working together, galvanizing the student movement, core, and all those. The summer of what was it 1964, where individuals helped, and other summers where they were pushing this agenda. I think it was 68. They were pushing this agenda, helping each other out, moving forward, ensuring that persons were registered, persons were part of the process. They had politicians on board after the fact, but it was the community. So is that spirit still here?
Well, that's the question that I raised, and that's the concern that I have, is that it's not still here, and I'll tell you why. You're talking about a generation, 1960s, 70s, that had more trust in institutions, that came up believing and still having that trust that if we push against the system, if we do things the right way, that the system, people will do the right thing. Politicians will do the right thing. This generation that has come up has seen the economy not work for them, has seen constant war from 9/11 to the present day. This generation doesn't have that same type of trust and faith in institutions. You see, for example, you could just look at the numbers. I don't have the stats, but the number of people who affiliated religiously and went to church and had trust in church versus now the number of people who are abandoning church are not going to church on a regular basis. It's because people don't trust institutions. And a lot of people, it's not that they're turning their back on God. They're still considering themselves to be spiritual. They're still considering themselves to be believing in God, but they're turning it back on institutions. So that's the challenge that I have, is that civil rights movement generation had trust in institutions. This generation does not. So how can you tell a generation that doesn't trust institutions that they got to push the institution to do the right thing, and they already don't believe that it is going to do the right thing? That's the concern that I have.
Yeah. And Will, you're exactly right. I share the same sentiments, but that's something that we got to figure out. But I am hopeful. I am optimistic. And I believe that we're going in a trajectory, in a way where we're looking at now what is equitable and equal across the board as it relates to participation in the process.
Now, I guess that's why you're an attorney and I'm a journalist. Attorney, you all always think you can win any case. And journalists, we're just naturally skeptical, so and suspect. But
hey, Will,
we'll see.
You keep pushing until you lose. So you're exactly right. Look, that's why I appreciate you, my friend, and that's why I believe that LaVeist and Claville is one of the best podcasts out there, and
you as well,
educate people on these issues. Real talk from real brothers. And if you continue to support us, continue to follow, like, and share. If you like what you hear, comment. And again, we wouldn't be here without you. We thank you for your support.
That's right.
It's like that, and that's the way it is. We'll see you next time.